All right, so over on Piers Morgan's show, he actually had a pretty interesting interview the other day where it was basically a conversation face to face, but over video, obviously, between war criminal John Bolton and the wife of Julian Assange, who is still under that threat of prosecution under the Espionage Act here in the United States and facing being extradited to the very country whose crimes that he exposed with his leaks under the WikiLeaks banner. So I wanted to get into this clip here. It's absolutely amazing to see. This is not something that you usually get to see on mainstream outlets like this, but we have Julian Assange's wife basically calling John Bolton a war criminal to his face. So let's go ahead and jump into this.
Their extradition should go forward, and when he gets to the United States, he'll get due process here, and I hope he gets at least 176 years in jail for what he did.
Stella?
Well, of course, Ambassador Bolton is kind of the ideological nemesis of Julian. He has, during his time for the Bush administration and later the Trump administration, sought to undermine the international legal system, ensure that the U.S. is not under the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction. And if it was, Mr. Bolton might in fact, be prosecuted under the ICC. He was one of the chief cheerleaders of the Iraq War, which Julian then exposed through these leaks. So he has a conflict of interest here.
Ambassador Bolton?
Well, that's ridiculous. I have an opinion. So does Assange's wife. I guess we both get to speak them. I think that what she fears is being brought to the United States and having Assange put under trial. If he's innocent, she can at least show reasonable doubt that he's not guilty, he'll go free. What's she worried about?
I guess what she's worried about is a fair trial, because it's pretty clear what the attitude towards him is.
Well, let her say
a large number of Americans.
That's fine. Let her say Julian Assange cannot get a fair trial in America. Let her say it.
Okay.
Well, he cannot get a fair trial in America because he is being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, and he cannot bring a public interest defense.
Okay, so, I mean, there you go. There were so many parts of that were absolutely amazing. I mean, first of all, you see John Bolton there, right? Somebody who is currently being called out by the wife of Julian Assange for his many, many crimes throughout the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and, the coup attempt in Venezuela and just so many different imperialist actions that John Bolton was involved in that you could definitely make an argument that he could be credibly prosecuted under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court if the United States actually abided by international law and was willing to have our own leaders, our own soldiers be held accountable for the war crimes that they are committing. So, I mean, number one, he was laughing at that, right? She's pointing out here that, he is a war criminal, essentially, telling that to his face, and he turns around and he just laughs about it. I mean, that's just absolutely insane to see that somebody who has so much blood on his hands would take this so lightly. I mean, this just shows you how much they really do understand the level of immunity that they get from their actions, as if they had no consequences, as if hundreds of thousands of innocent people weren't massacred in all of these different wars that he was an aggressive cheerleader for. So 100% correct by Stella to make that point about the fact that, if we abided by the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, that he would be prosecuted under those same terms. A couple of other different things that she mentioned there about a fair trial, which I really think is what this comes down to. And again, I mean, he's making this argument here as if Julian Assange, as if it's this ridiculous notion that he would not be granted a fair trial in the United States. Well, hold on a sec. You're prosecuting him under the Espionage Act, and the point that she was making there is that he, by definition, can't get a fair trial when you're being charged under the Espionage Act, because under that act, you can't even make a public defense argument. Okay, so in other words, Julian Assange can't go out there and say that, I was releasing these documents that exposed U.S. war crimes in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, etc. He can't make the argument that he was releasing those documents because it was in the interests of the general public to be aware of the crimes that our military, our government, was committing in our name with our tax dollars. I mean, he can't even make that argument. That's the core argument about what this entire case should be about, right? It's about press freedoms. It's about, what ability should journalists have in a society that claims to have a free press in order to expose the crimes of the government. So if you can't make a public defense argument, if you can't can't make this argument that it was in the greater good of the general public to have access to this information, which it definitely was, then there is no fair trial, because all they're going to be talking about is the details about what information that he was leaking and all of the minutia and trying to get him on certain minute violations of potential what should be really just considered journalistic practices. But I mean, just to touch on that a little bit here, this is part of the reason why even Obama's Department of Justice decided that they couldn't go after Julian Assange in the way that the Trump administration then followed up and actually did under the leadership of John Bolton, obviously having a direct role in that. But I mean, even Obama, who absolutely despised Julian Assange for exposing the crimes of the U.S. government, even he was coming out and basically making the argument, as pointed out here by Glenn Greenwald of The Intercept. They say, as the Obama DOJ concluded, prosecution of Julian Assange for publishing documents poses grave threats to press freedom. The Trump DOJ's prosecution of Assange will be cheered on by Democrats as they unite to criminalize the core of investigative journalism. And basically, the point that the Obama administration was trying to make is that if we go after Julian Assange for what he did with WikiLeaks and exposing these documents, then you could just as easily, under the same exact definitions, the same exact standards, go after literally any other investigative journalist who does similar work, who communicates with people within the national security apparatus, who communicates with people within the military, and then uses the information that they get from them to expose crimes or expose details of various stories in their publications. I mean, you could go after New York Times journalists. You could go after, all the, Intercept journalists, including probably Glenn Greenwald himself. I mean, you could go after any journalist who is actually doing legitimate work to try to expose the corruption, the dysfunction, the, inner workings and the crimes of our government. If Julian Assange is actually, they follow through on this and they prosecute him, then it's basically all up in the air, where the U.S. government can just willy-nilly decide to prosecute people on the Espionage Act as if, right, like this was some foreign spy who was doing this. He's a fucking journalist, right? He's not a foreign spy. And so this would basically criminalize or give the U.S. government jurisdiction to and set the precedent to criminalize what is just basic journalistic practices that happen on a literal daily basis in this country, and which really lay the groundwork for what it means to actually be a real journalist. So if this proceeds, which it looks like it's going to under the Biden administration, there's no sign that, they're slowing this down or that Joe Biden is going to come out in defense of Julian Assange or anything like that. So, I mean, this is probably the single greatest threat to the free press that we have seen in modern American history. Now, a little bit more on what she was talking about in terms of the International Criminal Court. Just as a reminder here, back under the Bush administration, right, during the height of the Iraq War, the U.S. government actually passed something called the Hague Invasion Act, which is just as insane as it actually sounds under the title of what it's typically referred to as, but this became law. So let's go ahead and read a little bit of the details here. They say here from Human Rights Watch, a new law supposedly protecting U.S. service members from the International Criminal Court shows that the Bush administration will stop at nothing in its campaign against the court. U.S. President George Bush today signed into law the American Service Members Protection Act of 2002, which is intended to intimidate countries that ratify the treaty for the ICC. They say the new law authorizes the use of military force to liberate any American or citizen of U.S. allied countries being held by the court, which is located in The Hague. This provision, dubbed the Hague Invasion Clause, has caused a strong reaction from U.S. allies around the world, particularly in the Netherlands. So, I mean, look at this. I mean, and they give a little bit more details here. I guess we could add this too. The law provides for the withdrawal of U.S. military assistance from countries that ratify the ICC treaty and restricts U.S. participation in United Nations peacekeeping unless the United States obtains immunity from prosecution. So you're willing to pull military support from other allied countries that ratify the ICC treaty, and not only that, but you are, at least in theory, willing to threaten to invade the Netherlands and to invade The Hague in order to liberate U.S. service members or U.S. officials or U.S. generals who are responsible for war crimes and where the international community is trying to hold them accountable for those crimes. So, I mean, obviously this is not something that would really happen in practice, because nobody would dare to oppose the power, the influence that the United States has on the global community, especially in Western European allied countries. So it's not really something that would legitimately happen. But the idea here, that the concept here, that the United States government would pass a law threatening to invade the Netherlands just if any of our people were held accountable for war crimes, I mean, it's completely fucking insane. It shows you the extents to which this country will go to protect our own war criminals. And John Bolton is, I think, adequately could be referred to as a war criminal. I mean, if anybody has blood on his hands in regards to our various ventures overseas in modern American history throughout my lifetime with all of these wars in the Middle East, I mean, it would be this guy. So here, as a little bit of context from the Rolling Stone, they say, if there were justice in the world, John Bolton would be handed over to the Iraqi government, perhaps for them to do as the Israelis did to Eichmann. He's not an international pariah on par with Rumsfeld or Rove, who were part of the main architect group that did the Iraq War, but they say he's easily as culpable as Wolfowitz, Pearl, Feith, or Libby in the fraudulent invasion and catastrophic occupation of Iraq, a disaster that eventually spilled over into Syria and now has people literally fleeing into the ocean. Unlike some architects of the Iraq War who had the decency to disappear from public life, Bolton continued to unapologetically defend the con job he did as George W. Bush's ambassador to the United Nations, even as he tirelessly agitated for war with Iran and North Korea and Venezuela as Trump's national security advisor. So, I mean, this guy is a war criminal. He is a war hawk through and through. And just a little bit more context here from the American or the ACLU here. They say below is a comment from Jamil Dakwar, the director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Human Rights Project. They say John Bolton threatened the International Criminal Court judges and prosecutors for investigating the United States war crimes in Afghanistan. He celebrated when victims of torture were denied the opportunity to hold their torturers accountable. He abdicated on our country's responsibility to its international human rights commitments. None of this was apparently disagreeable enough to the president. Obviously, they're talking about President Donald Trump there. So, I mean, listen, at the end of the day, when we're talking about John Bolton, this is probably one of the single least credible sources in terms of speaking about human rights, in terms of speaking about the subject of Julian Assange. I mean, not only does he have a direct conflict of interest here, as Stella Assange was just pointing out in that clip, because of all of his various involvements in the wars and the war crimes that Julian Assange, her husband, exposed. I mean, not only does he have a direct conflict of interest, but on top of that, he's on this show and he's making an argument directly to the wife of Julian Assange and saying your husband should be thrown in jail and sentenced to 176 years in prison, okay, more than even the human lifetime. And keep in mind, Julian Assange has already been put through absolutely brutal conditions, okay? He's been put in a maximum security prison. They had him held up in the Ecuadorian embassy, trying to, stay sane as his mind is, obviously being brutalized by this basically like confinement that he has been put in for years now. He's been subjected to near, if not outright, torturous conditions. And, this is a guy who his only crime really was exposing the crimes of other powerful people within the U.S. government, within the U.S. military, and, up to the presidential level under George W. Bush, under Barack Obama. Obviously, I would consider basically every single modern president since World War II to be a war criminal. But, I mean, he's covering his own ass here, and it's pretty, clear to see. And obviously, again, I mean, she was right on all of those points in terms of, how John Bolton could be prosecuted under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court if the United States wasn't, threatening to invade the Netherlands, if they actually held anybody responsible. But, I mean, on top of that, just in terms of Julian Assange and the current prosecution of him, I mean, this is, again, a direct threat to the fundamental concept of what it means to be a good journalist in this country, right? There's plenty of journalists out there in the mainstream media that we'd love to criticize because they just basically run like defense for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, depending on which network that you're talking about. They don't really do the deep investigative journalist work that a lot of other good journalists actually do. But this is just cutting straight to the heart of what it means to be a free press in this country, right? What it means to actually have freedom of the press in a true sense. Because freedom of the press doesn't just mean having the ability to go out there and criticize Donald Trump because he said something crazy on Twitter. Freedom of the press in a country like ours means you should have the ability to gain access to some of this classified or unclassified information when it's coming from, military leakers or intelligence officials, people within the national security environment. You should have the ability to expose information to the American people if it is in the broader interests of the American public, to be able to take that information in and then make decisions in a democratic system in terms of what we actually want to do, right? If we don't know that our government is committing war crimes in our name, with our tax dollars, with our military, then how are we supposed to hold them accountable in a democratic system? We can't. And that's the main goal here of John Bolton, right? He is defending this system where the U.S. military, the U.S. empire, the U.S. government basically just get to act with complete impunity on the international stage. You can launch illegal wars based on completely false premises. You can lie about, the justifications for those wars in front of the entire international global community. And then you can massacre hundreds of thousands, if not millions of innocent people for with absolutely absolutely no accountability at the end of the day. So, I mean, this is just absolutely wild to see this on a mainstream news outlet. You know, credit to Piers Morgan to some extent for kind of running a little bit of defense on behalf of Julian Assange and Stella, who was just on the broadcast. So credit to him for even setting up this interview in the first place. Pretty interesting showdown there. But I mean, at the end of the day, again, the message here is very clear. You have, you know, people like John Bolton, people like Donald Trump, people like Joe Biden, people like George W. Bush, Wolfowitz, all of the, all of the other architects of the Iraq War and people who were feverishly in support of that, as well as many other ventures overseas with, you know, Libya and, Yemen and all of these other examples that we could point to. And you have all of these motherfuckers who are not only walking free, but, many of them remain to be in public life. I mean, John Bolton, right, one of the main architects of the Iraq War who helped to sell that lie in front of the global community. And this guy just went and joined the Trump administration and continued to, commit international crimes that could be prosecuted under the ICC jurisdiction. So, I mean, there's no accountability for them, these war criminals, these criminals of the highest order that you could possibly imagine within society and around the world. No accountability for them. They still have the ability to have their freedom and to go on all of these shows and defend themselves and talk about, you know, their various crimes that they committed with a grin on their face, right? Making light of it. And meanwhile, you have somebody like Julian Assange, whose worst crime was just exposing their crimes, and he has been subjected to torturous conditions. He has been subjected to years and years in confinement, years in one of the highest maximum security prisons over in the United Kingdom, and soon to be, if things remain to be on track right now, extradited to the United States, and then given a completely ridiculous and unfair trial here in the U.S., where he's not even able to make that, a public defense and appeal to, this information being valuable to the general public. And then he's just going to be locked away here in the United States. And honestly, I mean, he'll probably die. I mean, if you listen to how Stella has talked about the current state of Julian Assange with his mental and his physical health that he is in right now, it's an absolute fucking disaster. I mean, it is a miracle that he is even still alive to this day. So, I mean, we got to keep our eye on this. We got to keep advocating for him to be released. If Joe Biden had any even mild ounce of credibility when it came to actually standing up for human rights and standing up for democracy and standing up for freedom of the press, then he would absolutely pardon Julian Assange and stop this extradition process immediately.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying